Good evening and welcome to a special session of our VIP talks. Today is a very special day. It's the yahrzeit of the Alta Rebbe, the author of the Tanya and the Shulchan Aruch. And every year on the yahrzeit, the soul goes up higher to a higher place, a higher world, a greater elevation. And if we remember, and if we follow, and if we're inspired by this soul, then we go up with the soul. We get a little bit of an elevation of our own from the soul of the tzaddik. So, obviously, we should talk about the Rebbe a little bit. The Alta Rebbe was one of the many disciples of the Maggid of Mezrich. The Maggid of Mezrich was the successor of the Baal Shem Tov, which means that the original concepts and teachings of the Baal Shem Tov came down to us through the Maggid, and from the Maggid to the Alta Rebbe, and so on through all the generations. Now, the other disciples of the Maggid had a different approach, or heard a different lesson from the Baal Shem Tov and from the Maggid than the Alta Rebbe heard. And there was a huge debate as to which was the truer expression of the Baal Shem Tov's teachings. The Alta Rebbe was practically alone in his approach, and that is the approach of Chabad. Chabad means using intelligence to inspire yourself. So one of the differences between Hasidus in Chabad and other Hasidus is that in Chabad, the objective is that the teachings of the Hasidus should create the Chassid. The ideas, the teachings, the principles, the understanding, all of this molds the chassid into a chassid. So it doesn't really matter what his native personality is or what his natural dispositions are. He becomes a chassid by understanding chassidus. In other areas, in other groups of chassidim, the chassidus matches the personality of the community or of the Rebbe. And so you get various styles of chassidus depending on the style or lifestyle or personality style of the chassidim. So Polish chassidim have their style, Hungarian chassidim have another style, Russian chassidim have a third style. But it's all the result of the personalities. Whereas in Chabad, the objective is, don't be inspired by something outside of yourself, create an internal inspiration. In other words, inspire yourself. How do you do that? Well, generally speaking, the lack of inspiration is in the heart, in the emotions. I don't naturally love God or fear God or get pleasure from godliness. So that's what needs to be inspired. Whereas the mind is not objecting. For a person who studies Torah, studies Hasidus, the mind is not the problem. The problem is inspiring the heart. So if you're going to have an internal inspiration, it has to come from the mind to the heart. So what you know, what you learn, what you understand, what your mind gets excited about, will create excitement in the heart. That's called an internal inspiration. We find this in a number of areas in the Torah, just very briefly, because I want to get back to the Alta Rebbe. Avraham inspired people by his example, by his holiness, by his godliness. Yitzchak demanded that people find inspiration where they are, in the condition of life that they find themselves in. Find your inspiration. In other words, create an internal. And that's why we find that Avraham dug wells, but the bad guys would plug it up. Avraham would bring water or wisdom to the people, but the bad guys would disrupt it or dismiss it. But when Yitzchak dug wells, those same bad guys would not dare to fill them up or to close them up. Because it's so much easier to interrupt the flow of inspiration coming from elsewhere than to discourage people who have found inspiration within themselves. So, there was a huge debate, sometimes a little acrimonious, between the students of the Maggid. When the Alta Rebbe published the Tanya, one of the sages, one of the disciples of the Maggid remarked, how do you put such a big God into such a small book? And what he meant was not that the physical size of the Tanya is small. Certainly not the size of a book that is surprising. What he meant was, a book is something you can read and understand. How do you put a big God into a reasonable argument, into a reasonable explanation and understanding? Because we know as a fact that God is beyond comprehension. That no thought can comprehend him. So it's surprising that we can comprehend God at all. We usually just use faith. We believe in him, we trust in him, but we don't really know him. So when the Alta Rebbe wrote the Tanya, there was a major change in Jewish life. God became available to our understanding. And how does that happen if we can't understand him? The statement that no thought can comprehend him is true, of course, without the revelation of Torah. The revelation of Torah literally means the revelation of God who gave us the Torah. So the Torah reveals God, which we otherwise would never know, because whose thought can comprehend him? But when he makes himself available in Torah, then we can comprehend him. In other words, the Alta Rebbe is famous for many different quotes in inspired moments. One of them was, I don't want heaven, I don't want Gan Eden, I just want you alone. The other quote is this, Ata Hayvei Das. You revealed yourself so that we would know. And the Rebbe translated into Yiddish. You, God yourself, your essence, revealed yourself in the Torah, Lord Da'as, so that we could get to know you. Which explains how we can today get to know God when in nature, in the laws of nature, a creation cannot comprehend its creator. So again, That's if God does not reveal himself. That's without the Torah. But in the Torah, God makes himself available. So let me share with you this story. There's a well-known story about the Alta Rebbe before he became famous. He was traveling in Russia, White Russia, and it was a winter night that he entered the Beis Medrash, the study hall, in Shklov. Shklov was a city of many, many scholars, great scholars. And in this particular study hall, the greatest of the scholars would study there. The greatest of all of them was a man by the name of Rabbi Yosef. He was called Yosef Kolbei. Kolbei means he's got it all. He was a great scholar. He was actually a colleague of the Vilna Gaon. Other than him, there were other scholars who sat and studied. And in addition to the individual studies of the individual scholars, there was also a class. A group of men would get together, and there was a teacher, and they would study together in class format. That particular day, the teacher of this class had a hard time explaining a really complex or difficult piece of Gemara in the tractate called Erchen. They struggled with it for hours and hours. They could not come up with a satisfying answer because they had this one big dilemma, this big question. So they went to some of the greater scholars, interrupted their learning, and asked if they could explain. And each one gave an explanation, but it didn't satisfy, it didn't click. When all else failed, they made an exception to their behavior, and they actually interrupted Rabbi Yosef Kolbei himself to ask him to give the explanation. At that point, the Alta Rebbe had walked in wearing his big fur coat, and he walked over to the furnace, to the oven, or the fireplace, or whatever it was that they used to heat the room, and he was standing, warming up at the fire. The short version of the story is that Rabbi Yosef Kolbei asked him. He looked like he was maybe a knowledgeable guy. So he said to him, would you like to try to explain this Gemara? And the Rebbe repeated the Gemara word for word, translated each word into Yiddish, just very simple, and then the words of the Rashi commentary, each word translated into Yiddish. He simply restated the words of the Gemara. And the people realized that their question was really not a good question at all. That's the story. The rest of the story is the reason Rabbi Yosef Kolbei asked the Rebbe to explain the Gemara is because Rabbi Yosef himself was giving an explanation when the Alta Rebbe walked in. The Alta Rebbe was listening to Rabbi Yosef's explanation. And Rabbi Yosef Kolbei, this fantastic, great scholar, saw the Alta Rebbe shrug at some point in his interpretation of the Gemara. And that was shocking, that he was taking it lightly, Rabbi Yosef's interpretation, understanding of the Gemara. So Rabbi Yosef Kolbei went over to the Rebbe and said, where are you coming from? What do you know? And the Alta Rebbe said, There is the attribute of Chachma, and there is the attribute of Malchus, or royalty. Malchus is all humility. It's all bitter. There are things that you know because of Malchus that you wouldn't know even if you're a Chacham. What Chachma can't understand, Malchus does understand. Why? Because Malchus is humble. So the Alta Rebbe said to Rabbi Yosef Kolbe, those who are humble know everything. And those who think they understand the Gemara probably don't. But Yosef was humbled by these words, and he said to the Alta Rebbe, in that case, you tell us, what is the meaning of the Gemara? What did the Alta Rebbe do? By quoting the Gemara, just word for word, translating them accurately, the question that they were struggling with all day disappeared. The meaning of it is this. You can sit and study any text, any subject, and you're coming to it as a scholar, so you're going to interpret what the text is saying. In this case, you're going to say what the Gemara means. Now, there is the teacher of the classroom, not the greatest sage in the hall. He'll try to explain what the Gemara means, but he can't do it. Can't come up with an explanation. Go to the higher, greater scholar. They tried, didn't come up with a good explanation. Now Rabbi Yosef Kolbe is trying. And what the Rebbe said to them was, you think you can explain the Gemara? Where's the humility? Humility doesn't mean I think I'm stupid. If you're a scholar, you know you're a scholar. If you're a great scholar, you know you're a great scholar. Humility doesn't mean deceiving yourself about yourself. Humility means I want to learn. I need to know. So when you come to the Gemara text, instead of telling the Gemara what it means, let the Gemara tell you what it means, because it certainly knows what it means. The Gemara knows what the Gemara is saying. Why aren't you listening to the Gemara? Why are you trying to bring an explanation to the statements of a scholar written in the Gemara? They're telling you what they mean. All you got to do is hear it. So that's what the Alta Rebbe did. It was not a miracle that he got the question to disappear. And he didn't give any explanation. He simply let the Gemara speak for itself. Then everybody understood what the Gemara was saying, not what scholars were saying about the Gemara. Now we have to add a very important dimension. The Gemara is different than any other text, secular text. Because in the Gemara, God revealed himself so that we can get to know him. As we started off saying. When you let the Gemara speak to you, who is speaking? You could believe or assume who is speaking is the author of that statement. Was it Rabbi Akiva? Was it Rabbi Yochanan? Was it Hillel? Who made the statement that you're studying? Or you can come with the approach, somebody edited the Gemara. Somebody put together all these quotes of Rabbi Akiva and Hillel and Rabbi Yochanan and all the other scholars. So it was the editor of the Gemara, Ravina Ravashi, or you could appreciate the fact that these rabbis, these sages, were simply expressing God's will. And therefore, if you understand the Gemara, you understand God's thinking. Because God invested himself in the Torah so that the Torah really describes him. Much more than any book describes its author. Even an autobiography. Because which autobiography is completely honest or accurate? So the writer never really lets himself, all of himself, come through in his writing. He wants you to know what he thinks, he wants you to know what he experienced, he wants you to know what he felt, but his essence doesn't come through. Because to put your essence into something is really, really difficult. God, of course, put his entire being, his entire essence, into the words of the Torah. Whether it's the written Torah or the oral Torah, it's all him. So if you let the Gemara tell you what it means, with the humility of the Alta Rebbe, you will always come up with the right answer. Because it's God himself telling you what he means. Now the same is true with the Tanya. See, when this tzaddik said, how do you put a big God into such a small book? What he was saying was, how did you capture God in this book? Because by reading the book, you really get connected to God himself. Of course, the Rebbe put himself into the book. And in that way, he is our Rebbe. Because he makes himself available to us through his book. In teaching Tanya, by the way, all the years I've been teaching Tanya since 1970, it's just beyond nature that a book written 200 years ago in another language other than English to a completely different clientele or readership from an absolutely religious or spiritual perspective. How that can be relevant to people in the 21st century or 20th century America is nothing short of miraculous. In order for it to have the effect that it does have on people who study Tanya, it has to be as if the Alta Rebbe was speaking to you. It's not the book that does it, it's the author. But the author doesn't come through in most books. In the Tanya, the Alta Rebbe comes through himself. You feel like you're getting direct personal information, guidance, wisdom from the Rebbe himself. And the Rebbe almost says it himself in the introduction, where he says, people are going to complain that reading from a book is not the same as seeing each other face to face, eye to eye. So the Rebbe was saying, read this book and you don't have to come see me. Read the Tanya and you'll get answers to the questions you otherwise travel all the distance from your home to where the Rebbe was and it's difficult in the winter, the rushing, the mud, the broken roads, the dangers. So the Rebbe says, don't bother making the trip because you have a question. The answer to your question is in the book. And the Rebbe says, I know you're going to complain and say that it's not the same. Not the same reading from a book as being with the Rebbe personally in a private audience and getting his advice directly. So the Rebbe says, I'm writing to you because I know you so well, and therefore it's as if I was there. Which means that the Rebbe had to put himself into our shoes. And he was a tzaddik, we are not. He had to be able to think through our mind, see through our eyes, walk a mile in our moccasins, in order to know us as thoroughly, as insightfully as he does, which you can see in the book of Tanya. Because the book of Tanya was written to non-tzaddikim. And yet the Rebbe's insight into the inner workings of our psyches is stunning. He knows us better than we know ourselves. He knows us better than our shrinks know us. And the only way he could do that is by putting himself into our mind and heart and seeing the world through those lenses. And that is amazing. Not only because he's a tzaddik and we're not, which makes us worlds apart, but even if we were in the same universe, we're still from different times, different cultures, different lifestyles. So it's somewhat miraculous, supernatural, for him to be able to understand us that way. But that's the Tanya. So if you haven't been studying Tanya, now is a good day to make the resolution that every day you should tune in to Chabad.org, where there are daily classes on Tanya. And in the course of a year, you'll cover the entire Tanya. The Alta Rebbe would certainly be happy with that. Concerning the Torah portion, we are reading about the conversation between, the ongoing conversation between the king of Egypt and Moshe and Aaron. There's so much, it's so rich. Every word, every exchange that Moshe had to say to Pharaoh, that Pharaoh came back with. This is not simply a stubborn dictator being difficult. Every exchange now has become the words of Torah. They may be quoting Pharaoh, but when Torah quotes Pharaoh, those words become the words of Torah. And every word in Torah has 70 layers of meaning and 4 different categories of Torah, the Pshat and the Remez and the Dush. So even when Torah quotes Pareh, it's not just Pareh anymore. Torah is finding Pareh's words extremely meaningful for all generations to come, and therefore records it in the Torah. So I don't know if we talked about this last week, maybe we did. Pharaoh had a God complex. People worshiped him like a god. He thought he was God. He found out that God, who created the world, wanted the Jewish people to make a dwelling place for him out of the lowest world, which is our world. Since he considered himself a god, He decided to act like God. So he took the Jewish people and he said, build me a dwelling place from the lowest materials of Egypt, mud and straw. And that's why when God comes to take the Jews out of Egypt, it's like saying, you've got the wrong master. You're not supposed to be serving him. He is supposed to be serving me as well as you. So don't serve a servant, serve the master plan. And that is to make the world a dwelling place for God. Actually, the Alta Rebbe was arrested by the Tsar and sentenced to death because he was accused of a number of treasonous activities. One of them was that he was supporting the Jews in Israel at the time. There was no Israeli government, but Jews lived in Israel, and they were very poor. And the Rebbe raised huge sums of money to support them there, and he would send that money to Israel. Now, Israel at that time was under Turkish rule, and the Turks were at war with Russia. So somebody slandered the Rebbe, saying that he is sending money to Israel to support the Turkish army against the Russians because the Alta Rebbe wanted to become the king of Israel. Anyway, of course, in the end, the Alta Rebbe was exonerated. But the Rebbe once mentioned that every falsehood has to have a kernel of truth in order to even get off the ground. So where is the kernel of truth in the accusation that the Alta Rebbe wanted to be the king? The kernel of truth is the Alta Rebbe wanted to make God the king, not over Israel, but over the whole world. That the world should be God's world, and that he should be the ultimate authority in his world. So when Pharaoh decides to enslave the Jews, it wasn't only because he was a dictator, because he was a control freak. That's how he could convince himself that he is God. If he could get the Jewish people to serve him and to build him a home or homes out of the lowest materials, then he is truly a God. When Moshe comes to Pharaoh and says, the God of Israel wants us to serve him, you can appreciate or imagine the affront, the insult. You're not my God. That's a lot worse than saying you're not my president. So Pharaoh is trying to maintain the image of a God, and that's what Moshe was fighting against, and that's what Egypt had to learn. Because that kind of idolatrous thinking was so poisonous, it was so corrupt, that it had to be fixed. Part of the reason that Jews came down to Egypt is to bring God to Egypt. And of course, Egypt was resisting, particularly Pharaoh. So when Pharaoh finally said, after the 10th plague, or even after the 8th plague, Pharaoh said, I think God is right, I've been wicked. That's the real purpose of coming down to Egypt. And when the Egyptians came to Pharaoh, after the 6th plague, and they said, can't you see this is the finger of God? If we keep fighting, we're going to lose everything. So The Egyptians realized that there is a true God. Pharaoh finally admitted that God is the real God, and that's when we were able to leave Egypt. Torah tells us that when Moshe came to the people to tell them that it's time to leave Egypt, they didn't hear him from a shortness of breath, exhaustion, and from the difficult living. What is this shortness of breath? The actual words, kaitza ruach, means shortness of spirit. Their spirituality, ruach, ruchnius, their spirituality was short-sighted, incomplete. They were very spiritual, but they didn't see it to the end. They were certain that being 200 years in Egypt was certainly no accident. God brought Joseph down to Egypt. Then God brought Yaakov and his children down to Egypt. This was all divinely orchestrated, like everything else in the world is by divine plan and divine purpose. So here they've been in Egypt for 210 years, serving the purpose for which they came to Egypt. Now this is before the plague. Moshe comes to the children of Israel in Egypt and says, the time has come for us to leave. And they said, how in the world could you possibly know that? God sent us here to do a job, and until that job is done, there is no leaving. We're not escaping. We're not here by accident or by mistake, and now we want to get out of here. It's not up to us. Like a group of women, Lubavitch women, had a convention many years ago in Detroit. From all over the country, they got together. And on the Sunday, when they were supposed to, all of them, fly back to their homes, the airport in Detroit was closed because of a storm, winter storm. So they called the Rebbe's office, and they said, we're all at the airport, and we're stuck here. We don't know what is it we should be doing. And the Rebbe objected to the word stuck. You're not stuck. You're there for a reason. And if you can't yet leave, it means that you have not fulfilled that reason. So see what you can do in the airport of Detroit, or go back to the city if you're going to have to stay overnight, because there's something else you need to be doing. It is not a mistake that you are there, and it's not a mistake that you can't leave yet. So this is what the people in Egypt were saying. We didn't come here by mistake. This is not a matter of escaping. When we finish our job, then we will leave. How do we know that our job is finished? If you remember, so that is their limited spirituality. They could see the purpose in exile. They could not see that the time of redemption had arrived. Moshe had to convince them. But also, if you remember, when God tells Moshe to go to the people, Moshe says, they're going to ask me, what is your name? What should I tell them? And the question is, the people didn't know God's name. From the time of Avraham, from the time of Noah, they all knew God's name. What kind of question is it? Secondly, if the people had forgotten God's name, Moshe certainly hadn't. So what is Moshe saying? They're going to ask me, what's your name? What should I tell them? Tell them the name that you refer to me with. So Moshe certainly knew God's name. What does God answer? God says, tell them I will be what I will be. What is the question? What is the answer? What's going on? The Rebbe explains it like this. Moshe says to God, I'm going to come to the people. I'm going to tell them that it's time to leave Egypt because you are compassionate, you heard their cry, you are feeling their pain, and you're taking them out of Egypt. They're going to ask me, what is his name? What they mean is, who is he really? He's compassionate. You know what's been going on here for 80 years? We didn't see any compassion. God brought us down to Egypt, into slavery. Now you come and say, no, God is all compassion. Who is he really? How can he claim to be compassionate after what we've seen, after the suffering and the horrors that we've lived through? That's going to be the question. So of course they knew a name of God, but they wanted to know, what is his real name? In other words, who is he really? How do we reconcile these two sides? He brings us down to Egypt, he takes us out of it. So who is he really? Or in different ways, what does he really want? So Moshe was saying, if they ask me that question, I'm going to agree with them. I have nothing to tell them. I am not going to justify their suffering. So what should I tell them? So God says, I will be what I will be. Which means there are parts of God that are understandable, we can appreciate. And then there are parts of God that we don't understand. And that's very much in keeping with God's name. We all pronounce God's name the way we do in the davening, as if it was spelled with an aleph and a dalid, right? But it's spelled with a yud and with a hey. So we do not read God's name the way it is spelled. And how to pronounce God's name the way it's spelled, we don't know. And yet, we have a name for God. And it's his name. You're not allowed to take it in vain. If you write it on a piece of paper, you can't throw the paper out. So yes, it is his name. But there's part of the name that we don't even know how to pronounce. And the reason for that is because there's part of God's justice and God's judgment and God's thinking that we cannot fully understand. And then there's the part that we can. Primarily, as I said before, the part that God explains to us in the Torah that we can understand. But what happens in the world after the Torah was written, there is no commentary on this. God is not telling us about it, so we really don't understand. Here's a quick example. Imagine you hear that your grandfather once took his son up a mountain intending to slaughter him as a sacrifice. What would you think? Guy's a monster. But now look at the Torah. The Torah says, and God tested Abraham and said to him, bring your son up as a sacrifice on the mountain that I will show you. It's a test. See, the Torah tells us, God is telling us, I tested Avraham. I never told him to slaughter him. I said to bring him up. And by not being clear, I tested him. But it was a test. Now we know what happened there on Mount Moriah. But without the Torah, we don't know, because we weren't told. So the things that God doesn't tell us about himself, we don't understand. So there's a part of his name that we can pronounce, and there's a part of his name that we don't even know how to pronounce. Until the coming of Mashiach, when God will again explain himself. Tell us what he was thinking and doing when all of these things happened. And that's part of Moshe's answer to the people. Moshe's answer was, when we leave Egypt, we will gather at Mount Sinai, and there God will tell us what he's thinking. With the coming of Mashiach, through Mashiach, God will tell us what he's been thinking for the last 2,000 years. Now, we have some stories already, but let's do just a story and its lesson. And that is that the Alta Rebbe called in a chassid, and he said to him, you have a mitzvah of supporting your family. You got to feed your family. I have a mitzvah of educating my child, teaching him Aleph Beis. So let's make a deal. I'll take care of your mitzvah, you take care of my mitzvah. Which means I'll give you what you need to feed your family, and you be the tutor for my son and teach him the Aleph Beis. When the Rebbe told this story with Friedman, he added a little detail. He said the chassid was very bright, and he saw an opportunity and didn't fail to take advantage of it. And so he said to the Alta Rebbe, you want me to teach your son the Aleph? I don't know what is an Aleph. He wouldn't do this if it weren't exactly those circumstances. To come to the Rebbe and say, can you tell me what the deeper meaning of Aleph is? The Rebbe wouldn't do it. But he's asking him to. So under the circumstances, the chassid felt that he could take advantage of this and get some wisdom from the Rebbe in exchange, in return. So the Rebbe said to him, after thinking about it, the Rebbe said to him, an Aleph is actually written, drawn, like two yuds and a vav. If you look at the little head on the right side of the Aleph, it's a yud. Then on the left side at the bottom, there's an upside down yud. And the stroke, the slant that goes from left to right, top left going down to the right, that's like the letter Vav, a straight line. So you have a yud on the top, a yud on the bottom, and a Vav that connects them. The yud at the top, that's God. First letter of God's name. The yud at the bottom is the Jew, because the Yiddish word for Jew is yid. Yid, or yud, right? So you have a yud on the top, a yid on the bottom, and you have the line of mitzvahs, Torah mitzvahs, that connect us. That's an Aleph. In other words, that is the ABC of Yiddishkeit. That there's God and there's a Jew, and the Torah connects us to each other. Now a definition. There is a Kabbalistic expression that people find fascinating, and doesn't always come with an explanation or even a translation. In most of the texts where this term appears, it's simply repeated and spelled out in English. It is not translated at all. And that is in the song, one of the Shabbos songs, we find the words chakal tapuchim, which literally means an orchard of apples, a fruit orchard. And it's part of the Kabbalistic description of Shabbos and holiness and souls and all sorts of stuff. What is the chakal tapuchim? What is the orchard of apples? Kabbalistically, an orchard is different from a field of grain, because grain is a staple, bread and butter. Right? Orchard is fruits. It's not a garden, it's not a field, it's an orchard. Orchard is where fruits grow. And fruits are treated as dessert, not a staple. You don't live on fruits. Fruits are therefore a delight, a dessert, delicacy. So chakal tapuchim would mean a level of godliness where it is pleasurable more than anything else. So in the divine attributes and in the divine worlds, spiritual worlds above our own, the orchard is the attribute of royalty, which is the 10th, the lowest attribute of each of the worlds. And in each world, the lowest attribute becomes the crown and the highest attribute of the next world below it. It's that missing link. So half of royalty is the lowest level of the higher world. The other half of this royalty is the crown, the origin of the next world. Because all recreation, all procreation comes from pleasure, involves pleasure. So chakal tapuchim means the royalty attribute of the highest world, which is the world of Atzilus. On Shabbos, we have a kind of a trickle-down effect from that level of godliness into our souls if we're open to it. And that's why it's a mitzvah to go visit your mentor, your Rebbe on Shabbos. Because the Rebbe is then connected to that higher level of chakal tapuchim, and he can therefore share it with you if you come to Fabring or to study and to pick up some of that energy. So that is the simple meaning of an orchard of apples. There, it could have been any other fruit. There's a reason why it's called an apple orchard rather than a pomegranate or whatever other biblical fruits. But in general, that is the concept. The pleasurable flow of godliness from a higher world to a lower world. And this repeats itself in each world. Okay, I see we have some questions. Probably the most fun part of the whole thing. Questions and answers. Yeah. Question number 1. Was the Alta Rebbe the only tzaddik whose soul was brand new when it came down to this world? I doubt that it was the only soul. Back in the early days, of course, souls were new. And in the time since they had their first life, their soul had returned a number of times. But this late in history, when the Alta Rebbe was born, it was rare to have a new soul come down. So certainly in our time period, the Alta Rebbe was unique in that his soul had not been here before. And that explains why he was able to uncover a part of Torah that had never been uncovered before. So he didn't just add another detail into what was already known. He brought a whole new awareness and created a complete lifestyle. Hasidic song, Hasidic foods, Hasidic customs, Hasidic language, Hasidic vocabulary. It was a whole new world that the religious community needed a lot of getting used to, because it was that radically original. Question number 2. How would you define idolatry? Really interesting, because we're just talking about this. How do you define idolatry? It's interesting that in the 10 Commandments, the first commandment is, I am God, your God, who took you out of Egypt. The second commandment is, you should have no other gods before me. And the question is, it's interesting and curious, what does it mean, you should have no other God? It's almost like saying, well, there are other gods, but you shouldn't do it. There are no other gods. So what does it mean, you shouldn't have another God? Wouldn't it make more sense for God to say, there are no other gods, I'm the only one. So don't look to heaven, to the sun, to the moon, to the constellations. Don't make gods out of them, because they're not. So why this subjective, personalized message? You should have no other gods before me. I don't know if this is actually a definition of idolatry, but it gives us a good insight. When a person has an opinion, when a person has a discovery, Isaac Newton was lying under a tree and an apple fell on his head. Anything about an apple? Oh, that, just as a joke, somebody said Adam and Eve had a computer, but it was kind of primitive. It allowed you only one byte, and after that it crashed. So one bite out of the apple, and that's it. It crashed. So everything seems to be with an apple. So Isaac Newton is lying under a tree. The apple falls on his head. He discovers gravity. And it was brilliant. His theory of gravity enabled the moon landing, going there and getting back, all based on the gravity of Isaac Newton. Then Albert Einstein comes along and says, you got it all wrong. You got it all wrong. The planets do not have a magnetic pull. I'll get this out of the way. The Earth or the planets don't have a magnetic pull that drags stuff back to the Earth magnetically. There's a whole different explanation. Now that's science. Imagine if we had said to Isaac Newton, who discovered this great insight into the rules or the laws of gravity. If we were to say to him, are you sure that what you're saying is correct? He would say, yes, I'm quite sure. Can you be mistaken? If he would say no, the theory and the proof to the theory is absolutely true, then he would no longer be Sir Isaac Newton, the scientist. He would become Rabbi Isaac Newton, the preacher. Because in human understanding, in all of the sciences, we may notice a fact, we cannot claim to know the truth. Because truth exists only in dogma and in religion. God can tell you what the truth is. Human beings can't. So what is the value of science? The value of science is that everything science discovers is real. But that doesn't make it true. See, there's a difference between the reality of a fact and the reality of truth. The reality of a fact is that I notice that certain things are a certain way. The fact. Is that how it's meant to be? Is that how it's supposed to be? Or is that simply how it happens to be? So we find in many areas in life where fact and truth are not the same. Like if you believe that all human beings are basically good, that may be true. It is not a fact. Fact is people are very bad. Does that then disprove the truth that essentially people are all good? No. Not every truth is a fact. Because in reality, there is the way things happen to be, and then there is the way things must be, and therefore will eventually be. When we say miracle, so something happened, it was a miracle. What we're actually seeing is that the fact surrendered to the truth. Jews needed to get to Mount Sinai. That had to be, but there was an ocean in the way, which didn't have to be there. So what happened? When the Jews continued on their way to Sinai, in other words, they walked into the water, the sea disappeared. What happened? The fact surrendered to the truth. When that happens in our world, we call it a miracle. God forbid you get into a car accident and you survive. You walk away. You say, wow, a miracle. Which takes us back to what God said about the suffering in Egypt. We don't understand why there is suffering. But what do we make of the fact that God took us down to Egypt, and yet we can't stop thanking him for taking us out of Egypt? That makes sense? Person gets out of a car accident unscratched, he can't stop thanking God. Who caused the accident? Person is in a hospital with a serious illness, and he miraculously recovers, and he's back on his feet, and he cannot stop thanking God for healing him. No, who made him sick? How do we reconcile this? If we use the example of a king who sends his army to war, he sends them to war, it's very serious. Go and fight and beat the enemy and protect the country and liberate us from whatever. Does he want to send them to war? If he's a decent ruler, a decent king? No, of course not. He hates it. He dreads the idea of sending his people, his children, to war. Why then does he do it? It's got to be done. It's sad that it has to be done. But now, when the king decides he's taking them home, bring the troops home. This is not something he has to do. This is something he delights in doing. This he does personally, like God coming down to Egypt to take us out of Egypt. Personally, not through a messenger and not through an angel. He came himself because this he loved. Sending us to Egypt, he hated. It was a strategically necessary thing to elevate Egypt and to destroy the myth of the god king. So why do we thank God when we are healed and get out of the hospital, when he put us into the hospital? It's because God enjoys and gets pleasure when he can heal us, gets no pleasure when we have to go through an illness. So God gets no pleasure putting us through exile, but it is his personal pleasure to take us out of exile. So what is idolatry? Idolatry means you can come up with brilliant ideas, but don't claim that they're true. They're just real. In fact, they are not the truth. And that means that no matter how great your theory is, and even with all the proofs that you were able to marshal, it can still turn out to be wrong. Someone else will come along with a better insight, a deeper insight, a better machine to test the results, and he will come out with a different result. So human beings are told in the second commandment, you cannot create truth. So you cannot make a God out of anything. At best, you can discover a fact, but truth is only with God. So idolatry means attributing absolute truth to anything other than God. Okay, we're going to go over time here for a few questions. Could you explain the difference between ruach, nefesh, and soul? Okay, the word soul is a general word that includes all parts of the soul. Ruach and nefesh are 2 out of the 5 parts of the soul. So when we say soul, we're using it in a generic sense. The entire soul. In Hebrew, the counterpart is neshama. When you say neshama, you're talking about the whole package, even though neshama is one of the 5 levels. But when we want to refer to the soul without getting into the details, we use the word neshama or the word soul. Nefesh is the part of the soul that gives life to the body or to the emotions. Ruach is the part of the soul that gives us intelligence. Neshama is part of the soul that gives us faith, belief. Chaya is part of the soul that gives us the capacity to have Mesiras Nefesh, to actually find something greater than life itself. And then Yechida, which is the core, central point of the Neshama, that's the little piece of God that is within us, one with God. Another question, which area of Judaism offers the training ground where we can practice improving our character, becoming less judgmental, loving fellow men as ourselves, humility, and emunah? Which area of Judaism offers the training ground? Everything in Torah demands improvement, growth, refinement. Just reading words of Torah, even if you don't understand it, has a refining effect, a purifying effect. Because if you do understand it, the effect is deeper. So every part of Torah, there is no training ground. You do a mitzvah, you read a piece of Torah, you nurture your soul, you discourage your animal soul, you discipline yourself by making the choice of godliness over humanness, and in tiny little steps, you move yourself from arrogance, selfishness, self-love, critical of others. All of this improves as you feed your godly soul and discipline your animal soul. So if you control your speech and you don't say things that you are tempted to say, your animal soul now knows that you're the boss. The godly soul is now nurtured. You are already a better person just by what you didn't do. So imagine how much better you would be if you were actually studying, if you were actually performing a mitzvah, and so on. Finally, that's not a question. That simply says, beautiful. Yes, it's beautiful. Thank you so much. Sorry we went over time. I guess the fresh air here in Florida is kind of inspiring, energizing, and it's a special day. The Rebbe told somebody, people, if you need a blessing, if you need something, health, income, shidduch, the Rebbe told somebody, personally, privately, that the days between the 24th of Teves, which is today, and Yud Shvat, today is the yahrzeit of the Alta Rebbe, Yud Shvat is the yahrzeit of the previous Rebbe, 6th Rebbe. So the Rebbe told somebody, in those days between the Alta Rebbe's yahrzeit and the Friedman Rebbe's yahrzeit is a very special time, auspicious time, when you can write to me for what you need, and I will take it to the oil. I will take it to the previous Rebbe, and you will get the blessing. So certainly that hasn't changed. These are special days, and if you write to the Rebbe at the oil, and put your problems in the Rebbe's hands, you will be helped, you will be blessed, and you will have good news. Gute Nacht.